The content of this podcast has not been evaluated by Health Canada or the FDA. It is educational in nature and should not be taken as medical advice. Always consult a qualified medical professional to see if a diet, lifestyle change, or supplement is right for you. Any supplements mentioned are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Please note that the opinions of the guest or host are their own and may not reflect those of Advanced Orthomolecular Research Incorporated. Hello and welcome to Supplementing Health, a podcast presented by Advanced Orthomolecular Research. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Herkel. This show is all about applying evidence-based and effective dietary, lifestyle, and natural health product strategies for your optimal health. We are going to feature some very engaging clinicians and experts from the world of functional and naturopathic medicine to help achieve our mission to empower people to lead their best lives naturally. Welcome to the Supplementing Health Show. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Herkel. We're just in the midst of a three-part all about genetics series. I've had the pleasure of chatting with Dr. Robin Murphy and Dr. Aaron Goldman, and I'd like to welcome them back for part 3. Welcome back, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
In this part, we're going to talk about some of the further clinical applications about some of the information you're going to get out of knowing your genetics. We talked a little bit about the introduction to genetics, what epigenetics is, and what that has to do with relating back to genetics and the difference between our environment and the way our genes are expressed. So everyone has a pretty good foundation. If you have any questions, go back and check out that episode. In part 2, we talked about some of the applications specific to about nutrients and diet. We talked about, can genetics inform us if keto is good for us or we're plant-based, and some of the nutrients that may be impacted by that. Mm-hmm. But we still didn't have time to talk about some of the gold that is really present in a really good genetic test. So we had to go back and we had to do a part 3. So here we are. In this episode, we're really going to zoom in on food sensitivities, and we're going to talk about gluten. That's a huge thing now. Do I go gluten-free or do I not? And if we have time, we'll get into some hormones and detoxification, because those are hugely relevant. But let's get right into food sensitivities. So I'm gonna ask Robin this, because I know that we've talked about this a lot. Mm-hmm. To do gluten-free or to not do gluten-free. I will set the stage by saying that clinically avoiding gluten with my patients has been a huge benefit for them. I do a lot of concussion recovery and brain injuries, and this is the one nutrient, the nutritional intervention that when they avoid gluten 100%, there's a huge improvement in things like brain fog, the gut-brain connection. There's really involved in inflammation, mm-hmm. which I know that is incredibly helpful. So I want to kind of get your take on gluten, and specifically what our genes might tell us about it.
Yeah, and I think this topic, there's so many different angles that we could talk about gluten. We could talk about environmental chemicals and the effect that it's having on the quality of our food. But today we're just going to focus on kind of the genetic implications and mm-hmm. how that can inform people of whether or not they actually need or should be avoiding gluten or doing follow-up testing to see if they have any sort of reactions to gluten. Because we know that gluten, so particularly gluten found in different grains, wheat, rye, and barley, some people will have a reaction to those proteins within those grains. And so that reaction is causing inflammation within the gastrointestinal system, and that can extend into the rest of the system. So we can see joint pain, fatigue, brain fog, digestive complaints, abdominal pain, maybe.
So not just symptoms localized to the gut, right? There are symptoms that are happening
widespread
throughout the body.
Feeling fatigued after eating, I hear that a lot, and that's not the only reason for it, but that can be, a sign that you're having a reaction. And so, the first thing in medicine, we want to kind of know, why are people responding, and should you actually be, avoiding gluten, because it can be a burden on people. any sort of dietary change, unless you're making it for a purposeful reason, can cause undue stress at the same time.
And a lot of the skeptics point that out. They're like, well, do you really need to avoid gluten? It's so stressful to do so. And I think that there is something to that. If we're just asking people to avoid things, is there some nutrients we're missing out by not eating wheat, which is primarily where gluten's found? But there are other grains that also play a role. So there is a psychological aspect to things. However, if a person truly has celiac disease, which is the main autoimmune disease that is related to the consumption of gluten, the body's actually creating an autoimmune response to it, and fortunate bystanders, our gut lining gets hurt, right?
Yeah, gets damaged. So, about 1% of the Canadian population is actually diagnosed with celiac, but 33% of the Canadian population avoids gluten. And so this is where you've seen
33%.
33%. Yeah. So and they're not strict, but this is where you've seen the explosion of gluten-free products, right? And people are really concerned about just trying it out. They're interested about trying gluten-free. So with genetics, you can actually look at a particular gene, and that can tell you whether or not you have a high risk for celiac disease. And that's the first place to start. So it's really important to understand, are you at risk for celiac? Because you may not have obvious symptoms of celiac, and it may not actually come up and have long-term, damaging effects until you've had the disease for a number of years.
Right. So is this something, and maybe this is a question for you, Erin, is this something that should be tested in young children and identifying, because based on what you just said, Robin, that the preventative power of that is really impressive.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. Your DNA doesn't change, so as a child or as an adult, your DNA, if you have the risk of celiac, then it's there as a child. So I think it'll be important to know early on.
Okay, and it's fairly the collection of the DNA is actually quite easy. As a bit of a sidebar, it can be done in infants if you really wanted to.
Absolutely, yeah. It's just a cheek swab, swab the entire cheek, just like a Q-tip. Takes about 30 seconds, and that's it.
Probably the most simplest lab sample collection that you can ever do.
Yeah.
So there's no blood involved. So that that's good. And then right away, if you have that, you have that positive, and maybe Erin, you can talk a little bit about there's this HLA component to it. What exactly does that mean? Because people that maybe are thinking about getting tested for celiac, they might have researched this on the internet or their doctors talked about this.
Yeah, and I think it's important to clarify the difference between the DNA test, which looks at the HLA gene, versus a blood test for celiac disease.
Absolutely, make sure we talk about that.
Yeah. So HLA is a gene. It's an immune gene that we all have, and everyone has different versions of it. So as part of the test that we do, we look at 6 different genetic markers within that gene. And we can identify whether someone's at risk of celiac or not. We can also identify if someone's excluded from the likelihood of having celiac, which I think is powerful. Because a lot of people, think they might be sensitive, but their DNA might say otherwise.
So what if you have only 2 mutations in those 6 genes? Is it all or none, or what's happening there?
It's a great question. So there's something called a haplotype. So we don't have to get too technical here, but it's we're looking at the combination of the 6. You don't have to have all 6.
Oh, okay.
You just you can have 1, you can have 2, 3, 4, and the different markers mean different things. Importantly, you bring up a good point. It just popped in my head. There are other tests out there. So some of these, big consumer genomics companies that do ancestry testing, some of them do offer information about celiac, but you have to be very careful because some of these tests only look at two of the 6 markers.
Okay.
So you might be in the clear from the 2 markers, but if you have a genetic variant in one of the others, there'll be a false negative there.
So So other particular mutations may be occurring in one of the other 6 that are not being tested.
Exactly, yeah.
Wow, okay, that's really interesting. Okay, so Robin, let's talk a little bit about the difference between celiac and wheat sensitivity. And just taking a step back here for our listeners, those of you that are thinking about, I've tried gluten-free and it's made no difference, I'm not celiac, is it still beneficial to avoid wheat?
Yeah. Well, there's celiac disease. It's kind of like a gradient or spectrum, where celiac disease is the autoimmune reaction to gluten, whereas non-celiac gluten sensitivity is where you don't have the antibodies to gliadin and something called transglutaminase. They aren't present, but your body's still having a reaction to it.
Okay.
And so that is, you can still test using other food
So you do a blood test to do that, or other food sensitivities?
Yeah,
okay.
To confirm. And then the important distinction is even if you're a carrier, doesn't mean that you're going to have celiac disease.
Oh, okay. Tell us about that. Why?
So what we're looking at is lifestyle diseases. And what that means is you can have a risk, but depending on the environment will depend on how your body actually expresses that gene or that disease. So with gluten and celiac disease, you can be what's called a carrier, meaning you have the potential to have gluten sensitivity or celiac disease. But we are starting to understand certain environmental triggers. So some of those environmental triggers have to do with whether or not you have an infection, a gastrointestinal infection. They've linked it to enterovirus and risk for, maybe it's adenovirus, but risk for the onset of celiac disease, as well as if you have another autoimmune disease, say type 1 diabetes, that'll increase your risk of celiac, and so that gene getting expressed.
That's so intriguing, because it goes to show that, yes, your genes are your blueprint, you're inherited, that's what you have for your whole life, but environmental, infectious things can basically trigger it. And the point that I want to make is that just because you have that particular mutation, it is one of the X's, or one of the strikes against you. You've heard of the 3-strike theory in cancer, where it's not like, what causes cancer? Well, is it the fact that I had asbestos in my house, or is it the fact that my mom had it? And it's probably, the answer is probably a combination of both. So this seems like one of those examples.
Exactly, and having a first-degree relative with celiac also increases risk,
Makes
and
sense.
also the amount of gluten that you're consuming can also trigger the body to produce the disease. So the important piece is knowing, okay, is there a risk factor? And then what can you do in the environment to reduce your risk of having that disease expressed?
We talked earlier, we've talked about this topic at length, and you mentioned about a study that was done, I believe it was in Denmark, and it was something to do with wheat in baby formula. Can either of you kind of share with that? Because I found the conclusion for that to be just really intriguing.
Yeah, so it was between, do you remember the study? Between Denmark and Sweden?
Yeah, I remember you.
And so it was a population study where they had started to see, I believe this is in the 70s or 80s, but they started to see this rapid explosion of incidence of celiac disease in children. And they said, this is really bizarre, what's going on here, because Denmark and Sweden have generally, similar genetic patterns as cultures. So they went back and looked and found that a company had decided to use 40 times the amount of gluten that is this other company was using and kids were being exposed to. And so because
in baby formula, right?
Infant
formula,
like infant foods, and so the amount of gluten that they were being exposed to at a really young age influenced how those genes were getting expressed. And so there was a 7-fold increase in celiac disease in these children compared to Sweden.
So something like an early exposure. So that's actually a really hot button question. There's now research coming out that you should eat everything early for peanut allergies, for anaphylaxis. It seems like this research is flying against that. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's actually showing that exposure is still fine, but it's the amount.
The amount, yeah.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, and so I wonder if that's the same with other, anaphylaxis types of reactions too. Does it have to do with the amount that the kids are being exposed to? And we, even just as a general, we know that when there's a variety of our diet and we're not just consuming, the same 20 foods over and over again, there's less likelihood that we're going to create an allergy to that.
Right.
Yeah.
There's so much in the whole wheat sensitivity and celiac world. I think we talked a little bit about this. Can you just quickly break down for me the difference between gluten, and then you mentioned gliadin, and then also the difference between celiac and then non-celiac gluten sensitivity or wheat sensitivity?
So the gluten is a protein, and that's part of the wheat molecule. So people can have a gluten sensitivity, and that's where the antibody is reacting to that gluten. So it's not necessarily autoimmune. It's just that there's
a food sensitivity.
Yep. So we can see whether there's a risk for non-celiac gluten sensitivity within the genetics, and it's not a diagnostic. So it's just saying whether there's a high or a low risk. So that would be an opportunity to go get food allergy testing.
Okay, so it's informing you to say, hey, I need more testing. So it's not diagnostic by any ways, and that's important to point out.
Yeah, and then with celiac disease, it's an autoimmune disease, and that's reacting to another protein or molecule within wheat, barley, and rye, and that's gliadin. And that is creating, when the body's reacting to that and binding to that molecule, there's a mix-up in the communication, and it actually causes the body to start damaging the lining of the gut. And what's interesting about that, when you start to get into the genetics and how these antibodies, they have little arms and they connect to these antigens, is how strongly they bind and how they bind can influence our reactions to these antigens or our foods, but also to other infections too. So this is part of our antibody or immune system. So there's research showing that if you are at a high risk for celiac disease, you can also be at a higher risk for mold toxicity as well as Lyme infections.
Interesting.
Yeah. So if you think about it, the body is so smart. It's creating these kind of networks of our infantry, to try and protect us from, certain invaders, right? And so it learns about it and adapts to its environment. And the genes can kind of influence how well we're kind of binding and identifying who's the enemy and who's the, what we're tolerant to, or kind of identify self. So
it almost seems like the person who has these mutations kind of got dealt a bad deck of cards, in the sense that now they're also susceptible to mold and Lyme. Is that kind of what you're saying? Yeah. That might be a little bit depressing for somebody to learn that. Is there what do you share with your patients if they have with this, that if they have this mutation, as a kind of a message of hope?
Well, usually in my practice, I'm seeing pretty sick people. So they've had chronic diseases. A lot of them have gone to many doctors, so they haven't been able to figure out what the issues are. So this is quite informative for them. It's actually giving them answers as to why potentially they got sick, or what was the mechanisms, and then what are the treatments that we're going to look at, or diagnostics. So it can help me to figure out, do we actually have to test for Lyme or mold toxicity? In Ontario and Toronto, over 50% of homes actually have mold. So 50%, because we're by the water. And I'm sure there's similar statistics, in Vancouver and other areas where older homes weren't meant to have basements. Essentially, it was kind of a storage and a cooling cellar, not for us to live
there, right?
Yeah.
And that is something that is going to have a huge impact on chronic disease when you're looking at these chronic infections and mold. And oftentimes, one of the key first steps of people that are experiencing these chronic issues is identifying food sensitivities and eliminating them, so the body can actually use these pathways properly, and the immune system cannot focus on food allergies or food sensitivities and focus on actually controlling an inflammation to do with mold or an infection, right?
Yeah, exactly. And we know that if someone is actually having a reaction and they're constantly exposing themselves to this trigger, the analogy that I like is if you have a cut and the cut's there and you keep scratching the cut, it's never going to be able to heal properly. You keep ripping off the scab or whatever your tics are, but what ends up happening, you never get to heal properly. So that's what happens in the digestive system. We're starting to understand more and more that these exposures are causing chronic inflammation, and that's causing an increase in the permeability of the digestive system. So most people know this as kind of leaky gut, but we're seeing real evidence that this is a major contributor to a number of chronic diseases. And unless we're able to kind of avoid some of those triggers, help heal up the gut lining, it's really difficult to kind of move the barometer forward.
I'd like to come back to the gluten piece because I think that's really, really valuable. But I just want to skip over to another part of the test that will give us insight into gut health and gut lining. So, Erin, I want to ask you a little bit about what is this glutathione pathway that's in the body, and just for if you haven't heard of glutathione before, it's the body's master antioxidant. It basically protects our body from damage, free radicals, and it's produced in our cells, primarily in the liver, but it's also very important for brain function. Clinicians use it a lot for repairing all the things I just talked about, but there's a connection between glutathione and gut health. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, I can just touch on the genes. So there's these genes that you might have heard of called GSTs, so glutathione S transferases, and there's a whole family of them. I believe there's 8 of them that we have in our bodies, and there are genetic variants as expected. If a genetic variant changes the function of one of these genes, which means if you can go back to the first podcast in this series, we talk about how genetic variants, changes in the DNA can actually result in a change in the protein, a physical change in the protein. So there are these changes in these glutathione pathway genes that impact its function. So we look at some of these genes in our testing, and we can provide recommendations on how to bypass the pathway if you need to.
So now that we have that information, clinically, Robin, how would you use that information if somebody is presenting with, I have gluten sensitivity or I even have celiac? How can you now start leveraging the information in like the My Blueprint test or another genetic test to basically have a therapeutic effect?
Yeah, so we know that glutathione is used as an antioxidant. It's used to protect our DNA, to protect our cells from further damage. And it's also used for detoxification, so making sure that we're eliminating any of the chemicals and byproducts from not only the environment, but also our internal processes. And so genetically, we also see that when people have alterations in these genes, some people can actually be missing these genes, that collectively that has a big impact on their risk for things like oxidative stress, which is kind of a general term for the amount of damage that can occur within the body, and DNA damage included. And so there's been links to development of cancers, development of cardiovascular disease. We're starting to look in female health, female hormone health, and how that can affect potentially breast cancers, but also endometriosis, as well as even response to treatments too. And so glutathione, once we identify that there's issues in this pathway, it's how well the body's able to take glutathione and then use it within the detoxification pathway. But there's other genes that also can affect your production of glutathione, as well as the recycling of glutathione, so risk for glutathione deficiency, as well as these internal cellular protection pathways. So it starts to give you kind of a plan of action. Do you help the body produce more glutathione? Do you help with the recycling? So things like say N-acetylcysteine is very commonly used. You can nebulize it. That helps with glutathione production within the lungs.
You breathe it in, yeah.
So there's a particular gene, GSTP1, which is mostly found within the brain, within the lungs, as well as with reproductive tissues. So when we know that there's issues in that pathway, we know directly, where to look if there's symptoms in those areas.
So it's better to take it in a breathing format rather than, say, orally.
Yeah, exactly. And are you going to help the body produce more glutathione, or are you just going to give the body the glutathione directly?
Right. Because N-acetylcysteine has always been considered a precursor to the formation of glutathione, that rate-limiting step in its production. But now you can actually purchase glutathione as a supplement, and there are various forms of it. Liposomal, which is basically combined in a fat, is really the most recent iteration of getting glutathione in, and it's a bit more expensive, and some clinicians swear by it, but some really find N-acetylcysteine being really helpful. So if you're missing these genes, does it make sense to take N-acetylcysteine and glutathione, or should we be supporting some of these supportive pathways that you mentioned with, for example, the broccoli family of vegetables has been shown to promote the, basically the glutathionization of and the production of glutathione.
Yeah, and you kind of jumped to my next point, but exactly, we're talking from a clinical standpoint, kind of the products that we would use, but people at home can also find out this information and know that some of these dietary ingredients actually are better at increasing our detoxification pathways, and particularly increasing the body's production and use and function of some of these genes. So people at home can start to identify and say, I'm going to eat more of these foods on a day-to-day basis, and this is going to help me kind of as a baseline, because we think of a holistic medicine. We want to start with food, then we kind of work our way up into getting into supplementation and more kind of potentized versions of the natural forms, but also looking at things like vitamin C, which can help recycle glutathione, some of the other antioxidants that help with the actual enzyme function, like selenium is a big one. Lipoic acid is another one, and we can look at foods, that contain some of these nutrients as well to kind of help overall.
Yeah, so like for example, Brazil nuts are a really good source of selenium, so I recommend that to my patients. In lieu of, let's say, an additional supplement if they're already on a whole host of things.
Yeah.
Some things you can get through diet, like you can't eat something that has glutathione in it. There are small amounts of glutathione in food, actually, but not from a therapeutic perspective. N-acetylcysteine as well, it's an amino acid. It's actually the highest found in whey protein. It's a really good source of NAC, and there are number of research studies looking at whey protein and the increase of glutathione. But I agree with you. Foods are
good
probably
for infections too. Those studies,
yes,
the whey protein. There's some
because there's
HIV,
other little things too
that
are part of whey protein, like lactoferrin, which are basically it's found in milk. It's found in breast milk as well as bovine milk. That these immune factors, they help promote the function of the immune system, which is anti-inflammatory and antibacterial, right?
There's another point that I think is important as well, is what I've seen too is people say, well, my antioxidant pathways are kind of deficient, or I heard that this was good, I'm just going to take loads of this for the rest of my life. And it's like, no, we're pretty dynamic as human beings, so we're responding constantly to changes in our environment, to exposures, and the body is extremely intelligent. So when we say antioxidants, it's really important to protect against oxidative stress. What's important to understand is that the body produces some of these other what's called oxidants, but it uses it as chemical signals. So it actually is important for the body in things like cellular repair or a programmed cellular death. So it's necessary. It's necessary. Yeah. And so there are studies that are starting to come out that is showing that if you're taking too much glutathione, and typically you see this with IV, When you're loading up the system, it's offsetting some of that balance between the antioxidants and
That's
the
a really
oxidants.
good point.
Yeah. And this is it's called the redox balance. But there are studies that show, if you're missing some of these glutathione genes, that you may want to be careful in over supplementing glutathione, and maybe focusing more on these production and ancillary pathways to help.
So things like the broccoli extract, the things like vitamin C, selenium, making sure that those building blocks are in place before just mega dosing. And so I think that's really valuable, because I think a lot of people listening might say, okay, hold on, I have some issues with my GST class of genes, as I personally do. And, first of all, you're not just dropping dead from that. Like, there are these other complementary pathways that the body can use to protect itself. So, for example, people that have an issue with this class of genes, they're at higher risk for cardiovascular disease and diseases of oxidative stress. So I think we just need to be a little bit more cognizant of things that might be damaging. So, for example, it probably wouldn't be a good idea if I was a smoker, as an example, because that's extra oxidative stress. And it probably would be a good idea if I kept an eye on my broccoli intake family of vegetables, right? I think is that kind of like the way to think about it? Yeah, and we know that this pathway is particularly important for pesticides, for solvents, so industrial chemicals.
So avoiding pesticides, certain pollutants, heavy metals also go through this pathway. So those are some of the areas to kind of highlight and also look at, what are your exposures, what are your symptoms, what is your family history? Again, looking at the genetics is just kind of a way for us to kind of understand, where to place that magnifying glass. And then our job is to figure out, how is it affecting the body, and is it appropriate for us to treat, or are there kind of lifestyle interventions that we can do for more of a preventative?
So, we covered a lot of ground. Let's just kind of summarize it before we kind of wrap up, because it's, we talked a little bit about gluten in the beginning, and, identifying your risk for celiac disease is one of the things that you find in this test, right, Aaron? And that is valuable information that you can then take and test more.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, and one thing that I think should be pointed out is the difference between like an allergy and a sensitivity or an intolerance. And a good example of that from the test is for lactose. So lactose intolerance is very common. 75% of the population have genetic variants in the gene that breaks down lactose. So what happens in those people is when they have lactose in their system, they're not breaking it down themselves. They have gut bacteria that ends up breaking it down, and that can lead to bloating and gas and stuff like that. Whereas an allergy to lactose, which is much more rare, would actually be like an immune response, similar to what we're talking about with gluten.
And it's important to point out, gluten is a protein where lactose is a sugar.
Right.
So a sugar usually, like you said, it's rare to have an allergy to a sugar, but you have allergies to proteins usually.
Casein, yeah.
Casein is a protein which is found in dairy. So just because you don't have, just because you're not lactose intolerant, that doesn't mean you don't have a dairy sensitivity. The difference between an intolerance and sensitivity is they're not the same. One is you can't break it down, intolerance. The other one is your immune system seeing it and reacting to it. And that reaction is what's happening in celiac disease at the worst level, at the autoimmune level. And then there is that kind of like gluten sensitivity, where if a person maybe is more inflamed, they have intestinal hyperpermeability, they've had an infection, or they've had a brain injury or something that has triggered that kind of intestinal leakiness, they may now be at a symptomatic risk, right? So we talked a little bit about that at the beginning, and that's a really great insight into the dairy sensitivity. And both of those are included in the My Blueprint test. So you're going to get the two most commonly asked questions, dairy and gluten, do I have to do that?
Right, yeah.
It's going to give us a little bit of insight. And then it might inform us, hey, do you need more testing? We could talk a lot more about gluten, in so much more detail. We did touch on the connection between, if you have this particular gene, you actually may be at increased risk for mold and things like Lyme, Borrelia, which is chronic infections, because they are part of the immune system. We didn't even talk about GMOs and glyphosate. We'll save that for another episode. But then I really like how we finished up talking about glutathione, which is one of the actual ways that we can protect the body and help heal the lining of the gut. So things like zinc, probiotics, fiber, vitamin D, vitamin A are really important at healing the lining of the digestive system. And so if you have that particular gluten and celiac issue, you should probably be considering some of those and working with a healthcare practitioner to help you that. But then, Robin, you talked a lot about our glutathione pathways, and that has to do with detoxification, has to do with our body's ability to prevent some of these long-term issues. What would be the final kind of takeaway that you would want to share, that you often share with your patients when they have issues with their glutathione production?
I think it goes generally with kind of any genetic information or information that people understand about themselves, is that this is actually empowering. This is helping you to make, significant changes that are going to have an effect long-term on your health. So, doctor comes from the Latin word meaning dossier, which means teacher. So the big takeaway is that, you get to teach yourself about some of the nuances of who you are, and then more importantly the information, how to move forward and really be responsible and take control of your health.
I'd even take that one step further and use the word empowered, because a lot of people consider that, I don't want to know about something that may have to make an uncomfortable short-term change in their life, like avoiding gluten, but long-term it's empowering to know that if I'm avoiding this particular food, I could be causing long-term health effects, not just in my gut, my whole body. And that is further taxing my own protection systems, glutathione. So now couple that, you have issues with gluten and that you're not making as much glutathione. You have a kind of that perfect storm where you should really be ultra vigilant. So I find that empowering with patients. And you touched on it beautifully, that it's all about teaching yourself. So that's all we have time to chat about today. It was really great to learn more about all the aspects of genetics. I want to thank both of you for your insights and your input. I think it'd be absolutely invaluable for the listeners to learn about this topic, and hopefully, and definitely it has been for me, but there's a much clearer understanding of how you can apply a simple genetic test. It's easy to do. It's not that expensive when you consider it in the grand scheme of things, and it can inform your treatment, it can inform your diet, it can inform the way you move your body, and all your lifestyle decisions. So I think that was really, really insightful. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you.
All right, looking forward to our next episodes. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you all next time at Supplementing Health Show. Thank you for listening today. For more information about our guests, past shows, and future topics, please visit aor.ca/podcasts. Do you have a topic that you want us to cover? We invite you to engage with us on social media to request a future topic, or email us at marketing@aor.ca. We hope you tune in again next week to learn more about supplementing your health.